Good morning. I'm Jason Ross, filling in for Harley Schlanger with your daily update for the LaRouche Organization on August 3rd, 2022. The situation is much worse and the military threat is much greater than almost anyone thinks, and we must take immediate actions to prevent a tragic collapse into nuclear war. Let's start with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. She left on her broomstick this morning, but during her short visit, she was able to really stir up the hornet's nest by crossing the reddest of red lines that China has. Her visit violates the One China policy that the United States has acknowledged as part of establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing in 1979. And during her time there, chatting and talking about cooperating on things like microchips and COVID and what have you, China has already begun to respond. Now, some people say China didn't blow her plane out of the sky, and that shows that she showed them who's boss, that she showed how tough the U.S. is and that China is cowering. That's not the case. That would make her a martyr. What is China doing? Well, so far, China has been putting on export controls on goods being imported to the mainland from Taiwan. Taiwan has an enormous trade relationship with mainland China, which should be no surprise since it's all Chinese. Enormous quantities of trade taking place. China is implementing some export controls. It is launching military exercises. Some of them have already begun, and they've announced closures of 6 areas surrounding the island of Taiwan from Thursday noon to Sunday noon, China time. These areas where the mainland is going to be holding military exercises and drills include live fire activity. It seems that they're going to be launching missiles also on the eastern side of Taiwan. This may mean either from ships or by actually shooting rockets over the island itself. I'm not clear on that. It means that the ports in Taiwan are going to be shut down during that activity because you're not going to have ships going around during that time. The zones where this military activity is going to be taking place are similar to what China had done and mainland had done in 1996, but this time the zones some of them are much closer to Taiwan and are definitely within what would be its territorial waters if it were an independent nation. And this is, of course, just the beginning. I mean, this is what we've seen so far. The other provocation on this is that today, coordinated with Pelosi's jaunt, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is going to be discussing the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022. This is a terrible piece of proposed legislation. It would pave the way for $4.5 billion worth of weapons to go to Taiwan over the next 4 years. It would end the condition that such weapons be defensive. Now anything that would deter Beijing from acting counts as something that's legitimate. It lays out conditions for sanctions against China, and it essentially recognizes or calls for the recognition of Taiwanese independence. I'll quote to you from the official summary of the bill from its sponsors in the Senate. They say this bill, quote, directs the U.S. federal government to engage with the democratic government of Taiwan as the legitimate representative of the people of Taiwan. Okay, doesn't that basically sound like recognizing the Taiwanese government? I mean, there's no way to square this with official U.S. position, which is that Taiwan is not independent and that there is one China and Beijing is its capital. According to the summary, this bill would also prohibit restrictions on federal government and official interactions with counterparts in the government of Taiwan. It calls for changing the name of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office to the Taiwan Representative Office, something that China has stated its opposition to many times. And then it ends by lying and saying at the very end that this act may not be construed to restore diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan, or to alter the U.S. government's position with respect to the international status of Taiwan. This combined provocation, along with what's taking place in Ukraine, along with what could potentially be taking place and already is to some degree in the Balkans, in Kosovo, This allows us to think about the nature of tragedy. Now, I was really struck by something that former U.S. Ambassador Chas Freeman said in an interview with Mike Billington. The interview is posted on the Schiller Institute website. Chas Freeman, in response to a question for his assessment of the activity of citizens around the world, here's what he said. He said, "I believe the general reaction internationally, and certainly in my own country, the United States, is one of despondency and a sense of impotence and frustration as the equivalent of a tragedy in the true Greek sense unfolds." "Everyone can see where this is likely to go," said Ambassador Freeman. "The protagonists nonetheless proceed on course, and the chorus is unheeded." So this is a moment in which indeed people should be giving voice to their objections to a course of action which unnecessarily risks a war, possibly a nuclear war. So he talked about tragedy. Now, what is tragedy? Is it a personal tragedy when an individual's life falls apart around them because of some terrible mistake they've made or some terrible circumstance they found themselves in? Or in one of the most famous tragedies, Shakespeare's Hamlet, is Hamlet a tragic figure? A man, a leader who failed to act to take the crown that is rightly his? Or, as we hear from other characters in the play, is there something rotten in the state of Denmark? The tragedy, is it in Hamlet? Is it in Denmark? Let's look at today. Is Joe Biden a tragic figure? Is this a tragedy? Is Biden failing to use his position to do good? Yeah, sure, obviously. But does the tragedy lie in the United States in the sense that this man in this condition could ever even become president? It's the latter. Now, Lyndon LaRouche's view of tragedy was that it's not about an individual failing to do something, an individual leader failing to do something, but it's about a society as a whole failing to produce within itself leadership, achieving the sublime solution of breaking with the axioms that guide society into the sewer, the tolerated beliefs that lead us to walk off a cliff into war. So think about the United States right now. Think about all the issues that are actually affecting people day to day. Inflation, terrible economic conditions, uncertainty about the future, cultural discord. But in all of this, there is unanimity within the parties on confronting, within most of the leadership of both parties, about confronting Russia through Ukraine, about supporting Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. 26 Republican senators wrote a letter supporting her activity there. This is the focus? So the question to you, to everyone, isn't about a vote. What will you do this week? What will you do today to prevent the U.S., to prevent NATO from acting as the catalyst that would unleash a global war? Now, let me talk about a few other of these hot spots and some other updates here. So in Ukraine, one of the bits of good news is that a grain ship has departed Odessa with its cargo. It's been inspected. As far as the conflict goes, Russia is claiming that the U.S. is helping Ukraine with targeting using the HIMARS rocket systems. If true, this makes the U.S. acting as a combatant, launching rockets that are killing Russian troops. Where could that lead? You see how, as this ratchets up, the potentials for miscalculation, for mistakes, for misunderstandings to lead to a destructive war. And this is the intent of that geometry. You know, this is something that Antonio Guterres said on Monday at the United Nations, at the discussions on the Non-Proliferation Treaty on preventing the growth of nuclear weapons. He said, we're one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Yeah, that's true. It's not weapons that are causing that, although you don't need so many weapons. The issue is geopolitics. So one other thing in Ukraine. There have been thousands of small anti-personnel mines reportedly cleaned up in Donetsk. Landmines, anti-personnel landmines, are illegal. This is one of the most basic things in international law. The Ottawa Convention, put together in the late 90s, Kiev signed it in 2005. It became active starting in 2006. It says there are absolutely no anti-personnel landmines allowed. And it appears that they've been shooting these things in rockets that end up dropping hundreds of these small mines, which lay on the ground. They're kind of camouflaged. They're green or brown. They're in a park. They're in the grass. They're on the street. You don't see it. You step on it. You don't have a leg anymore. This is barbaric and illegal activity, and it goes to show what sort of thing the U.S. is officially supporting. On the non-proliferation treaty discussions, Joe Biden said that the U.S. is eager to work with Russia to move towards limiting nuclear weapons. This is an important thing for the world, that China should also participate. It's hard to take this seriously. The U.S. under Biden walked out of discussions with Russia on strategic security following Russia's February entrance into Ukraine, and hasn't yet approached Russia about actually restarting them formally. China, meanwhile, says that it has a very small arsenal. It's not engaged in an arms race. It is not ever going to use nuclear weapons first. This is China's official policy. They will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. They're not interested in such a discussion, which, in bringing it up, it's almost as though Biden is saying we don't want to actually have a deal, because pushing for China's involvement really isn't going to work. So, coming back to finish up with overcoming a tragedy, the LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute, by name in particular, has been singled out on an honor roll of sorts by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. Its interim head said at a conference that was sponsored somewhat indirectly, but sponsored through funding and support from the U.S. State Department, said that his organization had compiled a list of information terrorists, he called us, who, quote, should know that they will have to answer to the law as war criminals. So here you have our tax dollars going to, American tax dollars and others, going to loony Ukrainians, calling terrorists and war criminals people who are sharing their views. So there's a lot of talk about democracies versus autarkies. This is how Nancy Pelosi had put it in Taiwan. You know, we're here to support democracy as opposed to those autocrats. What kind of democracy calls you a terrorist for sharing your views? Well, Ukraine does, and they're getting a lot of support right here. You know, Scott Ritter just put an article today in Consortium News where he talks about Chuck Schumer's role in this in particular, that he, in crafting the legislation that goes to support this kind of activity, branding as a war criminal, as a terrorist, his opponent in the Senate race this year. Diane Sayre is part of the group of 30 Schiller Institute speakers, representatives that lead the list published by the Center for Countering Disinformation. What does this mean about your ability or anyone's ability to have free speech? What about this wonderful democracy if the government is going to support and fund institutions calling for your trial as a war criminal for sharing your views? Meanwhile, take a look at actual interference of a very different sort in elections. So the FBI recently had raided some offices of the Uhuru movement, about, I think, a woman running for city council who had been to some conference in Russia, and this shows that Russia is interfering in our elections. Meanwhile, think about two things that happened in late 2020, both of which the FBI was involved in. The Whitmer kidnapping hoax, where it was revealed that a group of people was going to kidnap and potentially execute Michigan Governor Whitmer. That was never going to happen. Many of the people involved in that plot were FBI agents or informants. Whitmer herself was never in any danger. And then the declaration that Hunter Biden's laptop and the stories surrounding it, as well as the amounts of bribes and other money that he was getting, that all of this was Russian disinformation. That came from the FBI, and in fact from what seems to be the very same person who put together the FISA applications, or approved them, for Carter Page, which was one of the big jumps in the whole Russiagate scenario. So much for democracy, you can say. So what a real future demands is the escalation towards a new Bretton Woods conference, a new Bretton Woods. This doesn't mean doing exactly the same thing that happened at the original Bretton Woods conference, although the intention of Franklin Roosevelt is a good guide for today. But it means getting the nations of the world together, emphatically including the U.S., getting us off our tragic course, to be part of setting out a new paradigm for the world, for the elimination of poverty, for the development of nuclear fusion, for exploration of space, for the development of scientific and technological breakthroughs, of beautiful culture. This is what the world needs. And it's important that we fight and defend our freedom to have the needed discussion that can get us there. And that's why it is so important. I urge you, please, to share and we'll put this in the video description, share the statement from the Schiller Institute and Schiller Institute speakers denouncing the blacklist published by Ukraine. We need to be able to express ideas needed to avert a tragedy that could end human civilization. So that's it for today. Harley will be back tomorrow. So thanks for joining, and check out the video description for the link to the statement that I just mentioned.